Hello, my name is Dr. Michella Marino, and I am the Deputy Director of the Indiana Historical Bureau, and I've been in this position, it'll be about 2 years in November, and with the Bureau for about 2.5 years. And today, my colleague Joey Simins and myself are going to be talking with you all about finding and evaluating sources, and also making your county history relevant to all Hoosiers.
My name is Joey Simins. I'm a historian at the Indiana Historical Bureau, and I have been there for just over 12 years doing Indiana history, just like all of you. And today I'm also going to act as a storyteller. We're going to use some local stories from Indiana history and then get in and evaluate the sources and talk about the relevance of local stories to state and national history.
All right, we'll just jump right in here. So a few things before we get started. Here at the Historical Bureau and then also at the Indiana Historical Society, we obviously work with community members and community organizations to do local history that also has statewide significance. We know that county historians like yourselves are experts on your own history. You know the local stories best and what's important to your community. And you can also find ways to engage with people with that history by making it relevant to today, to the present. And so I want to talk about this idea of history relevance here for just a quick second. This idea of relevance is increasingly important in this day and age. The public needs to know that history is not just important for history's sake, not just to preserve interesting stories that we all want to dig into, but also for the ways in which it influences the present. And to borrow directly from the History Relevance campaign, we want folks to, quote, use historical thinking skills to actively engage with and address contemporary issues and to value history for its relevance to modern life. The best way to do this is to dig into the sources, both primary sources, secondary sources, and then to add context to those sources to craft historical stories that, again, are important to your communities and then connect to the region, the state, and national history as well. So what Jill and I are going to focus on today is how we find these sources, as well as how we evaluate and interpret historical sources. Some of this will certainly be a refresher for you all, but hopefully we'll also give you some ideas for places to look for news sources and information about your county and also your personal research interest. Since we all became historians because of the fascinating stories from the past and maybe not to just learn the ins and outs of every single historical database that's ever existed, we are going to start with a story from Indiana's early history. So we're going to give you pieces of that story, and then we're going to stop to look at some of the sources we use to craft that story as we go through the presentation today. But do not feel like you need to keep track of all the databases or of these particular sources. We're going to share our PowerPoint at the end of the webinar, and we'll also provide a research checklist that the Historical Bureau uses whenever we dig in to our marker applications and create our marker files. So we will share both of those resources with you when we are done for today. So for this webinar, we're going to take a narrative approach to how we use sources to inform our work and not just walk you through each of those individual databases and what you might be able to find there. We want to show you how this works in action. So this is going to be a show and not tell webinar about historical sources.
Well, let's start in with our first story. Imagine that the year is 1804. Picture a small group of men making their way through the thick southern Indiana forest. They're carrying equipment on their backs and they're dragging a chain in their wake. Every once in a while, they stop, they make a mark on a tree, or they plant a post, and then they record their progress, what they're doing, in a small journal. These men were led by Ebenezer Buckingham, and they were surveying the new Indiana Territory. It was a dangerous job, but it was an important job. It was dangerous because Indiana was still a wild place in 1804. And it was important because they were helping to make possible Thomas Jefferson's idea of a democracy led by small landowners. So how did these brave men end up here? So Jefferson had hired a mathematician named Jared Mansfield as the Surveyor General in 1803. At the same time, Congress and other government officials were working to open up the new territories to settlement. Mansfield needed to develop a technique for surveying this vast landscape that didn't include the time-consuming and even dangerous physical trek through the entire landscape, measuring with steps and landmarks. So Mansfield determined that he could create a meridian line, that's the north-south line that you're seeing right here, and then a baseline, the east-west line right here. And that this would be a foundation for a grid made up of 6 mile by 6 mile square plots, which were called townships. Locally in southern Indiana, in Du Bois County, this became known as Buckingham's baseline. So from the intersection of these lines, then survey lines could be calculated every 6 miles in all directions to create this grid of townships right here. And then from there, they could be further divided into 1 mile squares, creating 36 sections of land. And they could be divided further from there if needed. They would then be numbered and they could be sold to settlers without the government actually sending someone to check on each square mile. So while Mansfield mathematically planned the baseline, someone still had to mark it into the landscape. So that job fell to Ebenezer Buckingham, who we just met. He would long be remembered for his work. And it remains relevant today in a tangible way. We can see the effect on our landscape. Over here we have our some farms in Indiana, and you can see how much it reflects the survey system that gridded out our entire state, at that time a territory. So how do we know all this? Several ways. We can actually look at land records and the field notes that those surveyors took as they walked through the landscape. Here we're at the Indiana Archives database, and they do have surveyor field notes, which you can make an appointment to see. And many of these have been digitized by the National Archives. Here are actually Ebenezer Buckingham's notes right here. And there's volumes of these, and you can search them by the surveyor. If you know the surveyor's name, you can search them by the location. You can use the township number. It's really useful. And then there's this great source called Hathi Trust. And here on Hathi Trust, I just pulled up Mansfield's, this is his mathematical treatise that actually brought him to the attention of Thomas Jefferson. And Hathi Trust is a really broad source. I don't know if Michella wanted to jump in. It kind of has, for historians, replaced Google Books a little bit.
Yeah, so, and this is an important point to highlight too. A lot of times we think these records that seem very local to us might be in the local county historical society or library, and perhaps they are, but you would be surprised at what has been digitized out there. And so Hathi Trust is a great resource to look into. They've got a wide range of primary and some secondary sources as well, but just as Jill said, a lot of older books and publications that have been digitized and maybe previously were on Google Books are now on Hathi Trust. You can find things from old journals like Scribner's, but you can find military reports, colonial records, legislative publications, to sheet music. I mean, there is a wide variety of things, but again, that you would be very surprised to find on that are very important and relevant to both state history and local history as well. So we definitely recommend you check out that source too.
So this idea of the survey system was revolutionary at the time. And I mean this quite literally. After the American Revolutionary War, the British surrendered their claim to the colonies and ceded vast amounts of territory. So the young republic needed to pay their war debt, and the new government needed a system to organize the land for sale. In response to these needs, the Continental Congress created a committee chaired by Thomas Jefferson, who had come up with the survey ideas, to create a system for surveying all of this new territory. Now, Jefferson passionately believed that the system had to make small plots of land available to the individual farmer, as opposed to large plots for the wealthy, for speculators, or for companies, and that this was how democracy would spread through the territory. So the committee's answer was the Land Ordinance of 1784, and then also of 1785, which enacted the survey. And this defined and standardized surveying methods to create this grid of small plots of land. The surveyed squares, as we mentioned, would then be numbered and recorded for sale and sold to settlers unseen by the government. That is, they didn't have to have a surveyor walk each individual square, which is what they used to do. So the older system that was really time consuming required a surveyor's physical presence and then described the land by natural markers. You might buy a plot of land that was bounded by a creek and was 400 steps from the large tree that's by the old large boulder. And this led to major land disputes. In fact, there's a really good example of this, and that is Thomas Lincoln, who had bought several, actually two small farms in Kentucky. He bought the second one in 1815, and soon after that, both of his titles were challenged by competing claimants. And this is because Kentucky used the old system that defined the land by natural markers. So Thomas Lincoln ended up having to sell this land at a loss. He sold both of these, the claims that he did have at a loss, and he decided to move to Indiana in 1816, partly because he knew that he could trust the land that he bought there because it had been surveyed by this new system. Therefore, the survey system played no small role in bringing a studious young man named Abraham Lincoln, who would become the 16th president of the United States, to Indiana. So let's look at the sources again. We can go to the American Memory section of the Library of Congress to see all kinds of documents from the Constitutional Congress, Constitutional Convention, early House and Senate journals, House and Senate debates, the Congressional Globe, and this is where we were looking at the land ordinances. There's a Library of Congress has many more digital sources than just the ones available at American Memory, but this is a nice collection of these early sources from US history, and also that relate to the founding of the Northwest Territory and the Indiana Territory. We can also use the Bureau of Land Management to find land records based on our township, our range, our meridian, and even the surveyor. So you can go here and find claims that settlers bought directly from the government. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next story.
If I can jump in there for just a second, this is a great time to sort of make some larger connections here and show, again, the history relevance of local history. So if you're interested in finding a plot of land that, you know, your ancestor lived on, or, you know, you're researching someone in your community, you can use these sources. But then again, make that connection that this isn't just a plot of land in southern Indiana or central Indiana, that land is divvied up because of Buckingham, Mansfield, other people coming in and setting up this survey system on the behest of Thomas Jefferson, who has this vision for the United States. So again, we're starting local and we're coming out to regional and state, and then we're going to the national. This is actually it's the very fabric of the American story. So again, it's really important to understand and sort of reinforce the relevance of what might seem like a very local topic, but connects to a lot of larger issues, and again, into this national story of American history.
And in addition to this state, local, national perspective, let's add another one. The survey system that would spread this Jeffersonian democracy across Indiana Territory rested on the assumption that first, the native peoples in the area would be removed. So those land ordinances that we looked at earlier, the 1784 and 85, they actually started with the assumption that American Indians would be removed. And then the US government worked towards this end through military action, economic pressure, and treaties. In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which was the act that created the Northwest Territory. And that territory then became Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, and provided for a system for settling the area. Now, the US government saw the native population as the main obstacle to settlement. So between the 1770s and the 1790s, Indian villages across the Midwest were attacked by the American Army and militias. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Iroquois, the Miami, the Ottawa, the Wyandot, the Mingo, and more saw unspeakable violence, saw their villages burned and destroyed, and there were an unknown number of casualties. President Washington assigned General Anthony Wayne to battle a confederacy led by Miami, Shawnee, Lenape, and Delaware chiefs. After suffering major losses at the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was actually the last slide, many tribes living in the Northwest Territory were resigned to settling for peace. This resulted in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, in which tribal leaders ceded large areas of land in Ohio and Indiana to the United States and opened up the area for white settlement. After the Treaty of Greenville provided settlers with the prospect of peace, Congress passed the Land Act of 1796, which provided then for the sale of the land in the Northwest Territory. And this act reiterated that surveys would be conducted in these areas, quote, in which the titles of Indian tribes have been extinguished, sorry. So to go again to the sources, I think this is a really powerful source. This is the Treaty of Greenville, and you can access that at National Archives. I wish I could zoom in a little here, but these are the characters with which some of the tribal leaders signed the treaty. So you can see things like a small turtle, a bird, things that represented that tribe. And you can search for all kinds of treaties here. You can search by location, so you can actually find out about the people that lived in your county before settlement. So the other thing that we want to do when we add a perspective, when we understand that there's another story going on that's parallel to our story of settlement, then we want to go and re-examine the sources that we already looked at from that perspective. So here it's worth looking again at those land ordinances and seeing that in the very beginning, in the very first sentences describing the land ordinances, that they are saying that this is going to happen once American Indians are removed.
So again, to reiterate Jill's point, it's important to look at traditional sources in non-traditional ways to, again, sort of pull out these multiple perspectives and look at this from another angle and analyze these sources to pull out these other stories, right? So there's a lot of different ways to go about doing this. And I want to just highlight one example that's been very important to me in my own research. This is often used, this idea of using traditional sources in non-traditional ways, particularly when studying women's history. There is a famous author and historian named Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and I highly recommend her book to you if you've never read it, but it's called A Midwife's Tale. And this is an exploration of the diary of a midwife by the name of Martha Ballard, who lived in colonial Maine, Massachusetts area in the, well, colonial and then early part of the United States, late 1700s, early 1800s. And she left this diary behind, and many different historians had looked at it and it's like, oh, this is all trivial. It's just the weather and a couple little going-ons around the community. But when you actually dive into that source and read between the lines, you pull out a whole host of information about the women's economy of that area and how it connected to the male economy, and all sorts of different community events. And when you place her diary in conversation with her husband Ephraim, who was a miller and owned a sawmill and a grist mill and was also a surveyor, and he is going around and plotting the land in the New England in the northeast corner, you put her diary in conversation with the account books of his surveying work and also the local businesses and communities, you can find out a whole other host of information where she is trading goods in exchange for her own midwifing duties, and then those of her husband who is surveying the land and you know, purchasing different items for his business too. So again, it's re-examining some of these sources and finding out what other stories you can pull out. Another thing I would like to highlight has to do with oral histories. Jill, if you would go ahead and move on to the next slide. Also, when we think about traditional sources, we need to understand that those traditional history sources are following the European example. And this is sort of a hot word right now in the field of public history, but they're coming from colonized archives. And what I mean by that is that these documents, these land deeds, these records, these court cases, things like that, are coming from the perspective of the colonizers and are seen as the correct type of documents that we should use when producing history, when telling these stories. But we have to absolutely acknowledge that perspective, and that is only one perspective, and that there are missing voices and missing records, but those voices and records are going to be different than what we have traditionally used. So we need to turn to things like oral histories to get those stories, or look at those traditional sources in untraditional ways by pulling out this other information that is embedded in those documents as well. But again, it's important to turn to the communities in which we are also studying to partner with them and to find out what they view their history as being. So oftentimes when we talk about Native Americans and trying to do Native American history, they are viewed as being a people of the past, but they absolutely are not. These people are still alive, they still have vibrant communities, and they are still in our community as well. And so we want to talk with them and get their perspective and their story to piece together this larger narrative as well. And to throw out maybe one more example too, when you think about trying to study the Underground Railroad, for example, by its very nature, it is secretive. It is underground. They don't want people to know about it so it can be successful. So they're not leaving traditional records. They're not writing letters saying where they're helping escaped slaves move through the line to get to Canada or to the north, right? So we have to use other methods to try to uncover those stories. And again, that's where we want to partner with local communities, people who know the resources in that area, to again find oral histories, to use other artifacts, to find out whatever we can about this history, but it may not be just sitting in an archive waiting for us to find in this sort of traditional or in traditional sources.
And I think as people who tell these stories, that we need to keep these multiple perspectives in our minds. As Hoosiers, we share both the legacy of those industrious settlers who arrived following Jefferson's dream of a active democracy of small landowners, and we share the legacy of those Native people who were harmed to make that dream a reality. So, you know, for Thomas Jefferson and other leaders of the young republic, that group of men that we started with that were sent out to survey the Indiana Territory, from their perspective, they represent the spread of democracy. But for the indigenous people that first called this area home, the marks in the trees represented to them the impending and permanent loss of their home. And so right here we have the marker that we ended up putting up for Buckingham's baseline, which we feel like is a real success story for us. We worked very closely with the community in Du Bois County that wanted to mark Buckingham's contribution to the state, and we were all on board with that. But we also wanted to include this perspective of the Native peoples. And at first, I guess understandably, the community, they didn't want to include this just because it's a hard story to tell. Not that they wanted to silence anyone, but it's just not what they wanted to celebrate. But after a lot of discussion, we came together and we realized that we could tell both Buckingham's story, the story of Jeffersonian democracy, and the fact that Native people were removed in order to make this a reality. Michella, did you want to say a little more on the marker program?
You know I do, Jill. So Jill just hit on a couple really important points there. This idea of working with community partners, and really what is a key principle in public history, this idea of shared authority. Again, at the foundation of public history, that you have a collaboration with the community partners and stakeholders, and you're both bringing different sets of expertise or different angles to the story even, if you will, and are going to work together to try to tell the most inclusive, complete story or narrative or history for that particular community or that particular story. And you need to respect each side's expertise, their investment in the topic, and learn from each other. Both be open to new discussion, new perspectives, new viewpoints, but then also taking into consideration the multiple perspectives and the different types of sources that need to be used when you're trying to craft this type of narrative. And so we try, this idea of shared authority is at the very heart also of our state historical marker program, from the applications themselves that are driven from the public, what they think is important to their community, what stories they want told and shared, not just celebrated, because that's important to note as well, about commemorating these histories, just about, sometimes they're tough topics too. It's not just celebratory. But important stories that need to be shared, and that we would then work together on locating these sources, trying to, again, find primary sources and sometimes secondary as well, and then working together to craft many versions of the text before it makes it to this final one. But again, relying on that shared authority in the community partners as well. So I want to hit home just a few other conclusions or lessons that we can pull from Jill walking us through the story of Buckingham's baseline and how it also connects to larger stories as well. But obviously it's important to make local topics accessible and relevant to as many Hoosiers as possible, right? So we tell this story of Buckingham's baseline. We want to share the story of Buckingham and the surveyors that come in, because it's important to settlement of the state of Indiana. But what happened before that? Who was here? What were their claims to the land? What was their history? It's also important to share that perspective as well, and to be inclusive of marginalized voices and of the different Hoosiers that still live in this state, that have different stakes in this story as well. We also want to recognize that local history is American history, right? So again, when we start here with Buckingham's baseline and the way the land is plotted out, we can very easily trace that to the Northwest Territory and how land is being plotted, and how that then connects to Jefferson's ideas of democracy and Jeffersonian democracy and small farming and the type of country that we are going to be. So we want to put these local sources into conversation with the state and national ones as well. And again, I know Jill hit on this, and I have too several times, but the importance of multiple sources and multiple perspectives. Don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, if you will. And also, don't trust just one lone source, right? There's the importance of reliability and sources in conversation with each other. You don't, again, just want to rely on the land deed, for instance. You want to have multiple different sources that can help fill out and paint the full picture. And the final point here that I would want to highlight is the why. Why is this important? Why should I care? When we're telling these particular stories and looking at these particular sources, we want to know why they're relevant. And why others should be invested in this local story as well. And so you not only are trying to just tell the history for history's sake, which was sort of the first point that I was making here, but you want to share with your audience and the public that this is important because, right? That this is bigger than just this local history, that it actually connects to all these other things and help us understand the larger narrative of whether that's the state or whether that's the nation as a whole.
Sorry,
so Jill, if you...
I lost the connection there for a minute, but I'm back. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. You're right on time if you want to head us into story number 2.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, let's join up with our next story, which actually picks up kind of perfectly where our last one left off. So after this territory that became Indiana was open to settlement, hardworking farmers struck out across the Midwest to stake their claims and make a living. And at the same time, they made Indiana. Now, we don't often include African Americans in this story of early settlement, but as we're going to see right now, we really should. So free Black settlers, formerly enslaved people, and those escaping slavery established over 300 Black settlements across the Midwest, with the largest and the most successful in Ohio and Indiana. I just want to mention a couple notable examples. Roberts Settlement, Weaver Settlement, Sugar Creek, Beach Settlement, and Lyle Station, but there's many more that have been identified. So these Black pioneers who were fleeing threats to their freedom in southern slave states settled across Indiana, often near anti-slavery Quakers. And this was during the 1830s and 1840s mostly, but we have settlers back as far as the 1820s. So they came, they cleared the heavy forests, they drained swamplands, and they created productive farms. So like other pioneer Hoosiers, they then sent for their families, they established churches, schools, and stores. However, unlike other Hoosiers, Black Hoosiers arriving after 1831 had to register with the state and post a $500 bond guaranteeing, quote, good behavior, and that they wouldn't become wards of the state, dependent on the state. And then in 1851, with the new Constitution, Article 13 actually prohibited African Americans from settling in Indiana altogether. And yet, as we're going to see, Indiana's Black settlements only grew and prospered. So what's going on here and how do we know? Here, Indiana Historical Society's manual, the Elijah Roberts Papers, and within here, we actually can see his free papers, which are what he would have carried from the southern slave states across the country. Stopped, he's a free person, and he can have its own laws restricting this as a certificate of registration. And this is available in the Negro Register that is available at Indiana Archive. African Americans were supposed to register. Of course, many more came than registered. We can also also find the presence of these settlers through looking at land records. We talked about this a little bit earlier, that you can find the records of people that bought their land directly from the US government. You can see the Martin Van Buren's signature at the bottom here. And this is a Black settler that purchased land directly from the government. So, you know, not from a white person that settled and then Black people came into the space, that this was actually a Black space since settlement, since, you know, as we talked about earlier, the removal of Native people. But then Black settlers were among the first settlers in Indiana, which is an important point to make. We can also use the IUPUI digital collections. Now, a lot of the IUPUI collections are only for students, as you can imagine, but this collection is available. Okay, I lost the connection there again for a second. Sorry about that. The trials and challenges of working in this current pandemic from home. But I wanted to say quickly how useful IUPUI digital collections can be. They have atlases and maps and plat books. They have site surveys. You can see Sugar Creek settlement, which is one of the settlements right here. And if you were able to zoom in, you would actually see the name on that map. Ancestry is essential for finding out the race of people in an area. So we can pull up Sugar Creek, the area in the census, and then actually in this highlighted area here, we see a family and they're all marked with a B under race for Black. This can also be an M for mulatto. And so we can compare with the maps and other records. And then if we were on this database, we would scroll over and we could see that they were a farmer or that they were a shopkeeper or a reverend. And Ancestry, as you probably already know, is just such a great source for vital records. We can see people from the community getting married, having children. We can see their wills. We can see them leaving their property to their children. We can see them establishing schools. We can see church records, military records, etc. Also, when we are examining these settlements, we want to compare the documents that we're finding about the settlement with what's going on in the state. So at the Indiana Historical Bureau, we have this section of Indiana documents leading to statehood, and you'll see some of the documents that we covered in the last story here, but also this is where we accessed the 1851 Constitution and got the information from Article 13 about the prohibition of African American settlement. That the 1816 and the 1851 Constitution are available here in their entirety. Michella, did you want to jump in for a second?
Yeah, and again, I keep hammering this point away here, but particularly when you're looking at communities that maybe no longer exist or didn't leave traditional records, not to say that Sugar Creek community doesn't exist, that was poorly phrased, but the physical remnants of that community don't necessarily exist in that same space. Again, it's also important to use non-traditional sources and to return to family histories and oral histories as well. You can see a picture of the book here, an oral history of African Americans in Grant County, which highlights some of these early settlements and the stories that have been passed down from that. But if you also look on the screen as well, this is a picture of an exhibit that we had here at the State Library that was on loan about Weaver settlement. And so it's important to use material culture and artifacts as well to help piece together the history of the community as well. So we've got, you know, pictures of a church or school building, pictures of community members themselves, and then actual artifacts, lanterns, there's a hammerhead and pliers and other tools. But we can, again, pull all sorts of stories from analyzing these pieces of history too.
So what else makes the story of these Black settlers relevant to our state and national history? Why should we do all this digging for a community that maybe doesn't exist anymore except with these little scraps of sources? Well, I would argue that one reason is because of the contributions of these communities. Many men from the Black settlements signed up to fight for the Union cause during the Civil War. They fought for their country despite the fact that they didn't enjoy all of its freedoms. So some served in the fairly well-known 28th U.S. Colored Troops who fought valiantly at the Battle of the Crater, where over half the men were either killed or wounded. But other men, they couldn't even wait for Indiana to form its own unit. They wanted to sign up to defend the Union as soon as the call was made. And so some of these men from Indiana Black settlements traveled across the country at a time when this maybe wasn't the safest thing for them to do, to join other Black units. For example, during the Civil War, at least one Sugar Creek resident fought for the 55th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops. His name was Elijah Derricks, and he volunteered for service in 1863 when he was 38 years old, just before the state organized the 28th. He traveled across the country to join the 55th Massachusetts. So Derricks fought bravely, we know. We know he suffered from bouts of illness during this time, but he returned to his regiment each time. In 1864, he was injured at the Battle of Honey Hill, which was a Union initiative designed to further Sherman's march to the sea. And in 1865, the 55th marched into a conquered Charleston, arriving to the shouts and cheers of newly freed women, men, and children. And what a scene that must have been for him. We know Derricks carried his injury for life. He collected a pension for his injured arm when he got back to Sugar Creek. Now this sounds like a lot of things to know. So this is how we found out a little bit. So this is a record of Elijah Derricks in the 55th Regiment that we were able to access through Ancestry. We can also access a lot of these military records through Fold 3, which is similar to Ancestry in that it's a subscription database that you might have to access through your local library or come into the state library and access. But we know so much from this. Like we can see that he was sick here, and then we can see that he was wounded at Honey Hill, which is how he got his pension. And then if you're researching somebody that did serve in an Indiana regiment, we recommend, again, go to HathiTrust and then access the report of the Adjutant General of the state of Indiana. This is a great place to start if you're looking for records of Hoosiers who served in the Civil War. These are extensive. They show you the person's name, where they're from, if they were injured, if they were captured, battles they fought in, the date that they mustered in, the date they mustered out. This is just a great starting place. Graves can be a great source of information, but in this case, this is actually where we started. The story of Sugar Creek had been all but lost until some local people got interested in what is this little cemetery here. And it looks, they thought it looks like this is a military grave. Well, you know, we want to find out about this cemetery. We want to clean up this veteran's grave. And that's sort of how they became, the local community became interested in this. And this is actually Elijah's grave right here. And we can use some of these databases to find out more about graves and cemeteries. Find a Grave is a publicly accessible source. You can search by cemetery or by the person's name. The Shard database is accessible through DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, and you can search by cemetery in your area. It brings up a nice map. You can select cemeteries and then zoom in on those areas of your county. And then you can use Ancestry, as you probably already know, to find death records. And then your local library, your local historical society, or the Indiana State Library to find cemetery records and church records. Michella, did you have anything to add, or should I go back to the story?
And just one final point, I'm sure we'll talk about this again too, but as Jill said, you know, the physical remnants, the buildings, the churches, the schools that had been in Sugar Creek are no longer there. So again, it's local historians that they're finding these graves and uncovering what very little physical evidence is left of this community. But that's why it's even more important for us to sort of reconstruct this story and then return those stories to the landscape, whether that's in form of a historical marker or other programming or things that we can do on the local level to make sure that these stories are not lost, because again, they're very important to the larger story of settlement to Indiana and Hoosier identity. And so again, that's why it's almost detective work to figure out some of these stories, particularly when, you know, it's not as easy as, oh yeah, that building's been here since, you know, 1876, and we can just go find all the records related to that building. What happens when those physical things aren't there anymore? And again, this is how you have to try to piece together those stories.
Well, let's jump back into that story then. And I want to stick with the example of Sugar Creek and talk about what happened after the Civil War. So after the 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote in 1870, residents of Sugar Creek immediately joined the political efforts of the period. In August of 1870, they held a large 15th Amendment celebration at Thorntown, which was sort of the like the center of Sugar Creek, the most urban center. And that day, one of the speakers was James Sidney Hinton, who was a powerful orator, civil rights advocate in the Indiana General Assembly. Prominent men of the Sugar Creek community founded a grant club, and this was a political club promoting the successful presidential run of Ulysses S. Grant. By the late 1870s, newspapers began to show us the power of the Black vote in the area. So Democratic papers were actually poking fun at candidates for local office, sheriff, county recorder, auditor, for not being able to get elected without the Black vote. They often mentioned some of the local Quaker candidates who needed specific prominent men of color to back their candidacy. And they meant this as a criticism, but we can read it today as evidence of the power of Black leadership and suffrage in the districts. So the increased influence of the Black vote was tied a lot to the increase in the population. So by the 1870s, there were almost 200 people in Sugar Creek. They were not only voting, but they began serving on juries. And this change was threatening to some of the local white residents. So we know, again, from newspapers that in 1880, a white mob attacked a Black family that arrived nearby in Whitestown and drove them out of town. The newspapers claimed that it was the local Republican Party that was importing families like this, importing the men to vote and steal the election. They claimed that these Black settlers would never have come to the area on their own. Of course, when we have all this information about the local Sugar Creek community, we know that this argument is ridiculous. Black pioneers had been coming to Indiana from southern states for generations. The Democratic papers also claimed that the new arrivals were going to become paupers, burdens on the state, or criminals. Again, we look at the Sugar Creek community and we see that this is a baseless claim. Members of the Sugar Creek community, far from being paupers or criminals, they were farmers, they were shop owners, they were school teachers, they were reverends, they were barbers, ditch diggers, students, washerwomen, and as we know from what we found out about Elijah Derricks, they were soldiers and they were veterans. And they created a healthy community here at Sugar Creek. So as I mentioned, a lot of this information is coming from newspapers. Here is a database called Hoosier State Chronicles that the library hosts, and there are over 1 million pages of Indiana newspapers. This is an example from the Indianapolis Recorder, which is an African-American newspaper. And here's a little column that ran for a while on Thorntown, that downtown area of Sugar Creek. So following that column, we can see what the community is doing with their church, with their school, the new Masonic Lodge, or marriages and deaths, and of course, the politics that we mentioned. Library of Congress, through their site Chronicling America, has all kinds of newspapers, and they have a lot of Indiana newspapers. In fact, Indiana newspapers that we used to find out about the claims of the Democratic Party that the Republicans were importing votes. Some of those super local Indiana papers actually came from the Library of Congress, so don't forget to look at some of these more national sites. There's also great databases that are behind paywalls. A lot of times you can access these still through your local library. You can call and see if they have these subscriptions, or you can just come into the state library and use them there for free. Here we see the article about the first juryman that we can identify from Sugar Creek, which was one of those things that started to make the white community nervous about the power that the Black community was gaining. So here is our marker to Sugar Creek. And as Michella had mentioned earlier, before we just had the cemetery. That was the only thing telling us that there had ever been anything there. But as public historians, as county historians, you know, we can use our resources to return these stories to the landscape and make a richer, more layered history of our counties.
If I can jump in to highlight a few more conclusions from Jill's research and story about Sugar Creek, again, reiterating this point of using traditional sources in non-traditional ways, like with the newspapers, even whether it's the Black newspapers or the white newspapers, and trying to extrapolate information and meaning from that, and background and bias too, it's important. But also this idea of reality versus practice, or rhetoric versus reality, or paper versus practice. So again, this point of the 1851 Constitution excluding Blacks, no more Black people are supposed to move into Indiana from that point forward. But we also have traditional sources that blatantly disregard that, that show us that that actually wasn't the reality on the ground. We have maps that are showing Black people purchasing land. We have census records showing families growing and starting new businesses and getting married, and newspapers, and again, community memory, they all show otherwise, that there are these vibrant communities here post-1851 that are growing. But at the same time, keep in mind that many of the original settlers of Sugar Creek were illiterate. They were denied education by whites. And they also left different records. And so we have to come at this from a different angle too, and not just rely on the white newspapers or again, traditional sources. We need to also explore for untraditional sources too, because as historians, we cannot perpetuate injustice by demanding that these communities leave the same records as the white communities when white communities denied them the access and the resources to leave those same communities. So we really need to be more flexible, including using traditional sources in untraditional ways. I'm sure you're tired of me using that phrase at this point, but it's really important to think about. A few other lessons to highlight. You know, when you really dive into rural history here in Indiana and also Black history, you're bringing in overlooked voices and different perspectives that change the narrative about what we think about as rural history here in Indiana and our own Hoosier identity. In this version, people of color reclaim a central place in the Indiana settlement story, where they have largely been left out of that narrative for much of our history here. They are agents in forming the state and in helping settle it. And again, that has been denied in the previous history that's been told about the settlement of the Hoosier state. This also changes the narratives when you talk about, or people have often talked about people of color moving into white spaces in Indiana in the 20th century, or moving into areas with larger white populations, particularly in the early to mid 20th century, but that's not really true when you look at Black settlement in the state overall. And so stories like this remind them that people of color were active in establishing Indiana from that very early settlement period, 1820s and on. But again, to reiterate one more time Jill's point, that these stories are even more important when we have a lack of preserved sources or the built environment, buildings that are no longer there. That makes, you know, placing a historical marker or other community programs or initiatives to tell those stories even more important in reclaiming that landscape and the stories that belong to that landscape. And so Jill, I don't know if you have anything else to add there, or we can move on here to a little bit more about evaluating sources.
I was just going to circle back to the point about the newspapers, just that, you know, a lot of times we think of the idea of biased sources being a new thing, but really at the time that we're looking at this settlement, that newspapers were very much supporting one party or the other. So when we have a Democratic newspaper claiming that the Republicans are trying to steal the election by bringing in Black voters, then we need to look to the Republican newspaper and see, well, what are they saying about these groups? And then if we can, even better, add African-American newspaper to that discussion as well. And know that our sources are biased. We can still use them. It doesn't mean we throw them away. We just have to understand their bias and then put them into conversation with each other. Michella, did you want to talk more about the primary and secondary source reliability since we're on?
I do. Do we have a slide on that? I thought we had a slide. Yes. There we go. Okay. And this is maybe something we should have led with, but again, we wanted to stick with the stories and the narratives to show you how we create history and why that's important too, but better late than never, I suppose. But just to dive in a little bit more to make sure that we're all on the same page when we do talk about what a primary source is and a secondary source, and in some issues in terms of reliability and how we evaluate those sources as well. So when we do use the terminology of primary sources, again, those are sources that are produced by people involved in the event at hand or that lived during the time period. So these would be your firsthand accounts. These would be diaries, court records, any other sort of document. It could even be a photograph. There's a wide range that would be considered primary. And sometimes people like to lump newspapers in, but they can be a little bit trickier depending on how you're using those newspapers. Because generally they are produced by people that weren't at the event, or they're giving a secondhand account. However, if you're using the newspapers, let's take Abraham Lincoln, for instance. If you're looking at how the newspapers are talking about his childhood, well, that would be a secondary source then. But if you're looking at how the public responded to Abraham Lincoln's policies or his presidency, then newspapers would be a primary source because you're using them to see how people were talking about an event that was happening at the time. So newspapers can be a gray area. So I just wanted to highlight that point. But secondary sources then would be analytic or narrative sources based on primary documents. So they're looking at the diaries, the journals, the letters that are being left behind, and then producing a narrative from that. So those are created by people that did not witness the event or live in the time period, but are drawing on the primary sources to create that story. In terms of reliability then and evaluation and what types of sources to use, in terms of secondary sources, particularly those written by historians, both amateur and professional, there's a lot of popular history books that are out there. Those tend to be super readable. People really like to engage with those, but they tend to not be as well cited. They don't have footnotes. Sometimes they don't have bibliography. And I've found that in my own research here in this position, that sometimes that can be an issue with older or local county history books, where they were written, later by a historian or someone, but they don't tell us what primary documents or what interviews they were conducting to create those. So sometimes you have to be a little bit leery about those, or at least do more digging to back up those sources. Academic books tend to be really well researched. They tend to be really well cited, but they're often really dry and hard to get through and aren't as engaging. So that's kind of where the term emerges, reading like a historian. So you kind of get the thesis statement of that book, look what their sources is, figure out what their argument is, but you don't spend a whole lot more time with it. But in terms of primary documents, the point that I really want to highlight here is just because something is old doesn't mean it's trustworthy, right? People have been full of crap for all of time and have written down all sorts of things that aren't necessarily true, and they also have always had motives or biases in producing documents. Just because it was printed didn't mean that they weren't coming with a particular angle or a particular motive. That's just as true now as it was 200 years ago. And so we need to act like just because it's old doesn't mean that it's truthful. But that's why it's important to place sources in the context of the time and ask yourself the questions of, why was this produced? Who produced it? Kind of use those historical thinking skills. Even if it is something that is not truthful or is telling a particular version of a story, doesn't mean it's not useful. It absolutely is in crafting the narrative, but you need to figure out the why behind the source and to place it into context. And Jill has done a lot of research on the Klan in Indiana. And so a great example with that is here at the Indiana State Library, we have the Fiery Cross, which is the Ku Klux Klan newspaper at the time. Well, that has a particular racial bias and religious bias and a particular viewpoint. So you need to understand that when you're looking in that source and analyzing the articles that appear in that particular newspaper. And I also want to, sorry, go ahead, Jill.
No, that's what I was going to say. Did you want to lead us through revisionism to the end stretch?
I do, thank you. Yes. And so that was a pretty good segue into talking about this term revisionism. You've probably heard this in the media, heard it used by politicians. Sometimes this gets thrown into this debate about culture wars, but this is a dangerous thing that I want to dissect here for just a second. Revisionism is actually at the foundation and heart of history and how we create history. And so I want to sort of break through the myths that surround this and try to make it into a dirty word, because it's actually not. Sam Weinberg, a public historian, has this great quote that kind of explains this a little bit. So I want to dive into this. Sam Weinberg says, quote, "History teaches us a way to make choices, to balance opinions, to tell stories, and to become uneasy when necessary about the stories we tell." So by uneasy, what we mean here is that we challenge accepted viewpoints and what we thought we knew and understood about the past, right? When new sources come up, when we look at something from a different angle or a different perspective, we revise what we knew about that because of these new sources, because of this new angle or new lens we're looking at this through. So revisionism is often a problematic word for the public and the media, but revisionism doesn't mean the same thing for historians, and it's actually at the foundation of what we all do as historians.
And I'll just jump in with a quote from the popular historian Eric Foner to reiterate Michella's point. Foner said, "Historians view the constant search for new perspectives as the lifeblood of historical understanding. Outside the academy, however, the act of reinterpretation is often viewed with suspicion, and revisionist is invoked as a term of abuse. History always has been and always will be regularly rewritten in response to new questions, new information, new methodologies, and new political, social, and cultural imperatives. But the most difficult truth for those outside of professional historians to accept is that there often exists more than one legitimate way of recounting past events.
And that's a great quote to even jump back into the example of Buckingham's baseline, right? That story means different things to different people, and there's different angles to look at that. So interpretations of history change because we change, because our stories change, our perspectives change. And the past looks different with more information and perspective. History is not static, it's not neutral, and it's more than just a set of facts. It's an analysis based on sources and evidence, and that analysis is subject to change when, again, we're looking from a new angle, using a new perspective, or based on the discovery of new information or new documentation, new source work. So part of our job as public historians, as county historians, is to help the public understand how history is created, why we tell the stories we tell and when we tell them, and with what sources and evidence. And so again, we hope that we have, given you a glimpse into how we do this here at the Bureau and in the Historical Society as well. But Jill is also going to walk you through real quickly just a few more sources that we didn't necessarily get to or that we do want to highlight here that can hopefully help you in your own research and in pulling together county histories.
So we just want to encourage you to use the Indiana Historical Society, to use the Indiana State Library, the Historical Bureau, and right now, while we're all kind of stuck at home, to check out the digital collections. The IHS has a wide range of digital collections, as does the State Library. So make an appointment, come in and see us, but in the meantime, explore our online databases. Indiana Memory searches across the library and the Historical Society, as well as local libraries and historical societies. Come in, use those subscription databases that we talked about, Ancestry, newspapers.com. And if you just don't know where to start, ask a librarian. Go to the State Library website, click on Submit Your Question, and they'll get you started. Also, contact us at the Bureau, go to your county, go to the Bureau site, find your county, look at the historical markers in your county. Those can be great places. They have lots of footnotes. You might find other stories that you want to tell, or if you find great stories we don't know about, let us know about them. They might make for great historical markers in the future. And we're also going to send you this PowerPoint. We're going to send you the research checklist that we use when we're starting a topic. And then we just encourage you to contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for staying with us here through this webinar on source analysis. We very much appreciate the work you all do as county historians, and we very much like working with you. So please reach out to us here at the Bureau. I know Jeanette feels the same at the Historical Society. If we can ever be of help, again, in your own work, or if you want to talk through even any of the resources or the ways in which we do research here, we are historians. We love to talk about history, and so we would be very much happy to do that with you.